Hi, my friends. Today we are going to begin our conversation about Moses. I think it's helpful to talk about Moses in terms of like a trilogy. It's a three-movie trilogy involving the story of the people of Israel after the patriarchs and before they move into the promised land. So today we're going to be talking about episode 1 of the Moses Saga and what that looks like. This is a story that I imagine most of you are familiar with. Episode 1 of the Moses Saga is actually about Joseph. There is a VeggieTales double feature, The Ballad of Little Joe and Mo and the Big Exit. And what I love about it, both of them feature Larry. In one, he's Joseph, in one, he's Moses. They play them both as a Western, and they're played with the Joseph story being the prequel to the Moses story. And I actually think that's really helpful to think about. The Joseph story happens here at the very end of Genesis, and it leads us right into Exodus 1 with the Moses story as kind of the sequel to what happens with Joseph. So thinking of it in these terms, I think is helpful. So episode 1 of the Moses Saga is Joseph. So let's talk about what happens in this story. Well, during the time of Joseph, there is a Pharaoh who really likes Canaan, really likes the Canaanites. When you read the story of Joseph, you see a Pharaoh who sees the Jacob and his 12 sons moving down. He's appointed Joseph to be second in command. Joseph welcomes in his brothers and his father, implying also a number of other Canaanites also moving down because of this famine. So we have this Pharaoh who seems to be very favorable toward the Canaanites. And as a result, they're going to prosper. We talked about in class that there's a number of, very likely because of the Canaanites' experience with shepherding. Wow, I just realized that's probably where that word came from shepherding. That whenever the Canaanites move down, they end up actually making a lot of money for the Egyptians, and the Canaanites themselves are able to prosper because they're able to basically break into the sheep business via Goshen, and Egypt is making money, and they're making money, and everybody's having a great time. Well, a couple hundred years later, there's a coup. And this Pharaoh, something has changed where the Pharaoh who used to really like Joseph and this group of Pharaohs who used to like Joseph, suddenly they're gone. And when we get to the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, we see this phrase, there was a Pharaoh now in Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he's going to start hating Canaan. He's going to start hating the Canaanites, all the people who've come down from there. Just kind of this angry feeling and sentiment toward all the Canaanites. And that sets up, the slavery and the killing of all the babies and all that stuff that happens at the beginning of the Exodus story. So that's kind of our Joseph story in broad strokes, right? There's a Pharaoh who likes the Canaanites. Everybody's doing great. There's some kind of coup, and all of a sudden, these people hate Canaan again. Well, what we're going to find is that story from the Bible lines up pretty well with one of the dynasties we know about from the time of the ancient Egyptians. I want to talk about the Hyksos dynasty. The Hyksos dynasty is unique in kind of how it came to be and what its rule was like. And I want to talk about that for a second. So way back in the day, Egypt has this kind of deep hatred for the Canaanites. They would refer to them as those dirty Asiatics. Even the term Ivrit, the word used for the Hebrew, literally means the ones who cross over, the ones who have kind of crossed over the river. Almost said kind of like a slur, right? These dirty Asiatics, we hate them, is how the Egyptians would refer to them. So usually Egypt really doesn't like the Canaanites. But then there's a group of people, the Hyksos, who are actually going to migrate down from Canaan and are going to perform a coup. They're going to take over the pharaohship, the kingship from the Egyptian pharaohs. And now these Canaanites become the new pharaohs, these Hyksos. They're Canaanites who have kind of taken over the land, performed a coup and taken over the pharaohship. Well, as Canaanites, they love other Canaanites. And so they're actually going to open up Egypt's borders to welcome in a ton of Canaanites coming from the north. So people start coming in, specifically a bunch of Canaanites start moving into the land of Goshen, which we go, that sounds familiar, right? So the Hyksos rule for a few hundred years, for a while, and then after a while, we see another coup is performed, and the Egyptians come back into power. The Hyksos are thrown out, and the Egyptians take back over. Now, if we were paying attention to our Joseph story, we're going to notice that there's quite a bit of similarity between the story, kind of the transition from the Pharaoh at the time of Joseph to the Pharaoh at the time of Moses. It sounds pretty similar to our story here of the Hyksos dynasty. So we had one Pharaoh who loves Joseph, and then his people prosper. The Canaanites, they prosper under this Pharaoh who loves Joseph. But then there's a new Pharaoh who hates them. This is what we see in the Genesis story, right? Genesis to Exodus. Well, what we know from the Hyksos dynasty is that the Hyksos love the Canaanites, cause the Canaanites to prosper in Goshen, but then a new Pharaoh takes over, and suddenly they're not prospering anymore. What I want us to see is that the story of Joseph has quite a bit of historical memory. It's a word that Sandy Richter is going to use. Historical memory. Whenever the story of Joseph being coronated, being brought in to become second in command, that story contains details that you would have had to have been in the inner workings of the Hyksos dynasty for the relatively brief period that it existed if you were going to know those details. So either there's some kind of crazy scholar living amongst all these random slaves of the Canaanites, or someone was there and remembered these things. There's real historical memory, and it seems like the story of Joseph lines up really well with what we know of the Hyksos dynasty. And so that is going to be where we're going to end our time with episode 1, talking about the Joseph story, where there's this group, there's a Pharaoh who loves the Canaanites, and then there's a new Pharaoh who comes in who hates the Canaanites. Lines up pretty well with what we know of history. It's also going to make sense of why the new Pharaoh, the one who shows up in Exodus 1, why is it that he hates the Israelites so much? Why does he hate the Canaanites? Why is he so scared that they're going to take over? Well, because it happened, right? Previously, the Hyksos, these Canaanites, had come down, become numerous, and had taken over. So this new Pharaoh is scared for good reason, right? They have seemingly just gotten rid of the dirty Asiatics running their country and have reestablished control. So now he sees all these Canaanites growing and becoming powerful. He doesn't want that coup to happen again. And it lines up pretty well with what we know of history. All right, that's episode 1 of the Moses Saga. Tune in for episode 2 in our next video.